Welcome, viewers. You are about to hear a captivating tale filled with mystery, secrets, and dark revelations, written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. As the fog lifts over an ancient estate, a web of lies and treachery begins to unravel. Stay with me and prepare for a journey that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Don't forget to subscribe. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Curse of the Weeping Widow. Sherlock Holmes had long been familiar with the sound of London's cobblestone streets and the unrelenting rush of its people. Yet, as the carriage rolled over the mist-covered roads of Hathersley, a quiet village nestled between towering hills and dark forests, the air itself seemed to speak of something else entirely. The fog wrapped itself around the manor like a veil, shrouding its grand stone walls in an eerie embrace. Holmes had seen many places throughout his career, but the oppressive silence here was different. It clung to the land, as if something unnatural had taken root, a secret buried within the heart of the village. The manor, Thornfield House, stood at the centre of it all. From a distance, it appeared majestic, its windows glittering under the weak sunlight that pierced the mist. Yet, as they approached, Holmes could sense a palpable heaviness in the air, a tension that seemed to emanate from the very stone and timber of the place. The carriage came to a halt in front of the manor, its wheels crunching against the gravel like the first steps of a journey into an uncertain past. Holmes stepped out, followed by his ever-loyal companion, Dr. Watson. The chill of the morning air bit at their skin, yet Holmes stood unfazed, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene before him. "Quite a contrast from the bustle of London," Watson remarked, his breath visible in the cool morning. "I dare say, I feel the isolation already." Holmes did not respond immediately. His attention was fixed on the manor. The ivy-clad facade appeared almost alive, twisting its way up the walls as though reaching for something just out of sight. Holmes inhaled deeply, absorbing the details of his surroundings, the quiet rustling of the leaves in the wind, the faint smell of damp earth, and the whispering shadows in the corners of the property. There was something almost suffocating about it all. Something wrong. "Indeed, Watson," Holmes finally said, his voice low, almost contemplative. "There is a distinct stillness here, one that seems unnatural." He turned his gaze back to the manor, his sharp eyes catching every detail. The heavy curtains drawn tight against the windows, the closed doors that gave the impression of a place sealed off from the world. "I believe we are not merely here to investigate a crime, my dear Watson. I fear we are about to uncover something much darker." As they approached the manor's entrance, Holmes remained unperturbed, his demeanour calm, but a flicker of unease tugged at the edges of his mind. He was a man of logic, of reason, but even he could not deny the odd sense of foreboding that clung to Thornfield House. It was as if the house itself were aware of his presence, of the inevitable questions that would soon be asked. "Sherlock," Watson said, his voice carrying a note of caution. "Do you suppose the rumours about the curse have any merit?" Holmes did not immediately respond. Instead, he paused for a moment, eyes narrowing as he considered the weight of the question. The curse, so widely spoken of by the villagers, was said to be a direct result of the untimely death of Lady Eliza Thornfield's husband. His passing, so the tale went, had left behind an unnatural grief that had now festered into something more sinister, infecting the very walls of the manor. The widow was said to weep every night, her cries echoing through the halls, drawing a veil of tragedy over the estate. "It is a curious thing," Holmes said at last, stepping forward with a deliberate slowness. "Rumours often take on a life of their own, Watson. They become something more than whispers in the night. But they are only a reflection of something deeper, a seed of truth hidden beneath the surface. We shall see what lies beneath the veil of superstition here." They reached the grand double doors of Thornfield House, where the heavy wood seemed to groan in protest as it opened, revealing the darkened interior beyond. The hallway stretched out before them, lined with towering portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow the visitors as they entered. The air inside was thick with dust, and the faint smell of aged wood and mildew lingered in the corners, making the entire space feel forgotten, abandoned, as though it had long since ceased to be a home. A soft voice broke the silence. "Mr. Holmes, I presume?" Lady Eliza Thornfield stepped into the dim light, her presence both regal and sorrowful. Her pale face, framed by dark, flowing hair, bore the marks of sleepless nights, her eyes bloodshot and distant. She was dressed in mourning black, her figure slender and poised, though there was a sense of fragility to her every movement. Her gaze met Holmes with an intensity that conveyed both a desperate need for answers and a fear of what those answers might be. "Lady Thornfield," Holmes said, his tone measured yet warm, his sharp eyes taking in her appearance in an instant. "I trust we are not intruding. Dr. Watson and I have come to offer our assistance and to investigate the recent events you have described in your letter." Her lips trembled slightly before she spoke, her voice wavering but steady. "I am grateful for your help, Mr. Holmes. There is much that I cannot explain. The house, it is not what it once was. I fear something has taken hold here." Holmes gave a small nod, acknowledging the weight of her words without speaking. His mind was already turning over the details as he stepped into the manor's interior. The darkness of the house seemed to press in around him, each shadow hiding something waiting to be uncovered. As they followed Lady Thornfield deeper into the heart of the house, Holmes couldn't shake the feeling that the manor itself was watching them. The oppressive silence seemed to grow thicker with every step, as if they were not merely entering a place, but stepping into a story that had already begun long before their arrival. The mystery of Thornfield House had only just begun, but already Holmes could sense that there was more to the widow's tale than grief and superstition. Somewhere within these walls lay the truth, and it was his task to find it. Lady Thornfield led them down the long corridor, her footsteps echoing softly against the wooden floors. The manor seemed to breathe around them, each creak of the floorboards adding to the heavy stillness that hung in the air. Holmes kept his gaze sharp, noting every detail: the intricate wallpaper that had faded with time, the dusty tapestries that once told grand tales of the Thornfield family, now draped in the quiet sorrow of neglect. Yet, it wasn't just the physical decay that caught his attention. It was the atmosphere itself, thick with an unspoken grief, a palpable sorrow that seemed to saturate the walls. "You mentioned strange occurrences," Holmes said, his voice calm but attentive, as he turned his head toward Lady Thornfield. "Could you elaborate?" "I assume they go beyond the mere whispers of the townspeople." Lady Thornfield's hands clenched the fabric of her black morning gown, the movement so slight it almost went unnoticed, yet Holmes saw it, the subtle sign of a woman on the edge. She paused before a door, her shoulders stiff, as if preparing herself to face something she had been avoiding. Her lips parted, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. She began, her voice faltering. "I don't know how to explain it, Mr. Holmes. It's as if the house itself is alive. At night I hear footsteps that are not my own. I've seen shadows move, though no one is there. And sometimes, in the early hours, I can hear weeping." She lowered her gaze, a shiver running through her. "It is the weeping widow, they call it. The curse." Holmes's expression softened, not with pity, but with the measured sympathy of one who had seen much and understood the fragility of human emotions. He regarded Lady Thornfield carefully, noticing the way her body seemed to shrink inward at the mention of the weeping widow, as though she were bracing herself for something worse than mere superstition. "I see," Holmes replied, his tone unchanged. "A woman in mourning is often susceptible to imagining things that align with her grief. However, the mind does not create the sounds of footsteps or the presence of shadows. That, I believe, must be a matter for investigation." They continued down the corridor, and as they passed an open door, a figure emerged, tall and gaunt, with sharp features and a stiff gait. The man's eyes were narrowed as though calculating, his expression hard, and yet there was something about him that suggested more than just formality. He regarded Holmes with a cool stare before his lips curled into a thin smile. "Ah, Lady Thornfield," the man said, his voice smooth but laced with an underlying tension. "You've brought guests, I see. How fortunate." Lady Thornfield's expression softened at the sight of him, though there was an unmistakable distance in her eyes. "Mr. Hammond," she greeted him, her tone polite but distant. "These are Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. They are here to assist with the peculiar happenings in the house." Mr. Hammond's gaze flickered toward Holmes, a hint of skepticism flashing in his eyes. "Holmes, you say?" he murmured, as if the name itself held little weight. "I trust you're not here to indulge in the local folklore. This is a matter of personal grief, not idle curiosity." Holmes, ever the observer, noted Hammond's tone, sharp, dismissive, and a little too quick to push aside the investigation. There was something off about him, something in his posture, his guarded expression, but Holmes said nothing. Instead, he allowed the silence to settle, his keen mind turning over the brief interaction as they all moved further into the manor. "I assure you, Mr. Hammond," Holmes began with quiet certainty, "I never indulge in superstition. My work is concerned with uncovering the truth, regardless of how it may present itself." Hammond raised an eyebrow at that, as if appraising Holmes's sincerity. He did not respond immediately, but instead turned his gaze back to Lady Thornfield. "If you'll excuse me, my lady," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality, "I have matters to attend to." As Hammond retreated, Holmes turned to Lady Thornfield. His eyes narrowed slightly, catching the brief, almost imperceptible glance of unease that passed over her face. She wasn't as unaffected by Hammond's presence as she appeared. "Mr. Hammond seems tense," Watson remarked, breaking the silence that followed. "Is he a friend of yours, Lady Thornfield?" Lady Thornfield hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the retreating figure of Mr. Hammond before she answered. "He is a family friend, Doctor. Watson. He has been helping me with matters of the estate since my husband's passing. I rely on him, particularly now." Holmes studied her for a moment before nodding. His mind was already racing through possibilities. Hammond's quick dismissal of the investigation, his aloofness. There was something in his demeanor that did not sit well with Holmes, but there was no time to address it now. His focus needed to remain on the matter at hand, the strange occurrences in the manor, and the mystery of the weeping widow. Lady Thornfield led them into a sitting room, the air inside heavy with the scent of old books and polished wood. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. As Holmes took in his surroundings, he noticed the opulence of the room, the fine furniture, and the delicate porcelain vases that stood on pedestals. Yet, there was something stark about it, an emptiness that only added to the unsettling atmosphere. The large windows, though grand, were covered by thick curtains that let in little light, and Holmes could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in from outside. "Please," Lady Thornfield said, gesturing to a pair of armchairs by the fire, "make yourselves comfortable." Holmes and Watson sat, each of them acutely aware of the oppressive silence that followed. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, which seemed too quiet for a room this grand. "I assume you are familiar with the rumours surrounding Thornfield House?" Holmes inquired, his voice breaking the stillness. Lady Thornfield nodded, her face growing paler as the subject turned to the legend of the curse. "The weeping widow," she murmured almost to herself. "They say my husband's death has cursed the house, that my grief has manifested in some dark force that haunts this place." Holmes's eyes lingered on her, studying the fragility that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface of her composed exterior. "Grief is a powerful thing," he said, his tone measured. "But it does not leave behind shadows or footsteps. That, I suspect, is something else entirely." The fire crackled softly, its warmth offering a brief respite from the chill that hung in the air. Holmes's sharp eyes remained fixed on Lady Thornfield as she spoke of the strange occurrences that had plagued her nights. Watson, ever the compassionate companion, was beginning to voice his own concerns when a sudden sharp knock on the door interrupted the conversation. Lady Thornfield's eyes widened slightly, a quick flicker of unease passing across her face before she swiftly masked it with a delicate smile. "Excuse me," she said softly, rising from her seat. Her voice, though gentle, carried the weight of something deeper, something unspoken. She opened the door to reveal the constable, a stocky man with a red face and a voice that seemed to carry the heaviness of long days spent under the sun. "My lady," he began, his tone more rushed than usual. "There's been another incident. You'd best come quickly." Holmes's gaze shifted to Watson, who returned the look with a quiet nod. It was evident that this was not a matter that could be dismissed so easily. Lady Thornfield's composure faltered for the briefest moment, but she quickly regained control, offering only a slight nod to the constable before turning to the detectives. "Please," she said, her voice more strained now. "Follow me." The group hurried out of the sitting room, and as they traversed the cold, dimly lit hallways of the manor, Holmes noted the oppressive silence that seemed to follow them, the same stillness that had permeated the house since their arrival. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the thick carpet beneath their feet, but it was the growing tension in the air that truly gripped Holmes's attention. Something had changed. There was no longer any hint of mere superstition. Whatever was happening at Thornfield House had moved beyond the realm of the imagined. Lady Thornfield led them down the narrow staircase that spiraled into the depths of the manor, her movements swift but measured. The stone steps, worn by time, seemed to groan under the pressure of each footfall. The dim light from the torches lining the walls flickered uncertainly, casting long shadows that danced on the stone like spectres in the night. The air was colder here, the stone walls absorbing the warmth of the upper floors and holding it at bay. They reached a small, enclosed courtyard at the rear of the house, where the constable was already standing, his hand resting on the hilt of his baton. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously between Lady Thornfield and the ground before him. Holmes's gaze immediately followed the constable's line of sight, and he found himself staring at the body of an elderly man, his form crumpled near the well that stood in the centre of the courtyard. The man's body was lifeless, his eyes open, fixed on something in the distance. His clothes were torn, as though he had struggled violently before his death. The faint smell of earth clung to the air as Holmes approached the body, his senses immediately drawn to the odd details of the scene. The man's hands were clasped tightly around a small worn piece of paper, which, Holmes noted, seemed to be a letter of some kind. "This is the fourth time," the constable muttered, his voice tinged with a mixture of fear and frustration. I don't know what to make of it, sir. The poor man was just here yesterday, asking about the curse." Holmes knelt beside the body, carefully taking the letter from the man's hand. As he unfolded the paper, his eyes scanned the contents quickly, noting the disjointed and frantic writing. The message was cryptic, filled with references to something hidden within the walls of Thornfield House, and a warning about the truth that would be revealed only through sacrifice. "This is no coincidence," Holmes said quietly, his voice low, yet filled with an eerie certainty. "This man's death is no accident." Lady Thornfield had remained silent at the edge of the courtyard, her gaze fixed on the lifeless form of the old villager. A shudder passed through her as Holmes stood, his mind already working through the implications of what he had read. She turned to him, her eyes wide with dread. "What do you mean, Mr. Holmes?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't think—" "I believe," Holmes interrupted, his voice now carrying a note of resolve, "that this man came too close to something, a truth buried deep within the house itself." His gaze shifted to the well, its dark depths seemingly swallowing the pale moonlight that illuminated the courtyard. The eerie stillness of the scene was broken only by the distant sound of a single owl's call, its voice carrying across the grounds like a lament. "The curse," Watson mused aloud, stepping closer to Holmes. "Do you suppose it could be real in some sense? Could it be connected to this?" Holmes shook his head, his sharp eyes scanning the courtyard once more. "No, Watson. There is nothing supernatural at work here. This is the work of a very human hand. Of that I am certain. Lady Thornfield stepped forward, her expression pleading. Mr. Holmes, you must help me. This cannot be a mere coincidence. Holmes met her gaze, his piercing eyes softening ever so slightly. I intend to, my lady. But first, we must piece together the truth, and that will require us to investigate every corner of this house, every shadow, every secret it holds. As Holmes spoke, the wind picked up, rustling the branches of the trees that surrounded the courtyard. The night seemed to draw closer, as though the manor itself were drawing them deeper into its mysteries. Holmes turned toward the body again, taking one last look before rising to his feet. The weeping widow, Lady Thornfield. That is what they call it. But I suspect that we are not dealing with a curse at all, rather something much darker, something someone is trying to conceal. Lady Thornfield's eyes flickered with a flash of both fear and recognition, and for a moment she seemed to shrink under the weight of his words. The mystery had only just begun, and already Holmes could feel the dark undercurrents of the house beginning to reveal themselves. The wind had picked up, its sharp gusts swirling the fog around Thornfield House, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. The courtyard, once a place of life, now felt like a graveyard, its stone well standing as a silent witness to the tragedy that had unfolded there. Holmes stood motionless for a moment, his mind already spinning with the details of the death and the strange letter found in the dead man's hand. His sharp eyes narrowed, scanning the surrounding area for anything that might provide further insight into the cause of the villagers' demise. "Let us return inside," Holmes finally said, his voice breaking the oppressive silence that had settled around them. "There is more to be uncovered, and we are no closer to understanding what lies beneath the surface." Lady Thornfield nodded, her face pale and drawn, but she said nothing as she led the way back into the manor. The constable, visibly shaken by the discovery, followed in their wake, his feet dragging as if the weight of the death was something he could not easily shake off. As they entered the manor, Holmes turned to Watson. "We must examine the house itself, Watson. The truth is hidden within these walls. Of that I am certain. It is the only place to look now." "Are you suggesting," Watson asked, voice tinged with disbelief, "that the cause of the man's death could be tied to the house itself? The rumours of the curse?" Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he allowed his eyes to flicker around the room, taking in every detail. The furniture was antique, though slightly worn, and the walls were adorned with family portraits that seemed to gaze down upon them with a solemn, almost accusatory expression. The house was grand, but it had been allowed to fall into a state of disrepair. Dust covered nearly every surface, and the air felt thick with the passage of time. "No," Holmes said at last, his voice firm. "The curse is a distraction, Watson. It is a veil that has been placed over something far more insidious." Watson gave a soft grunt of acknowledgement as Holmes moved purposefully through the room, his long fingers brushing the edges of the wooden furniture, his mind calculating, processing each piece of information. Every clue, every oddity, was a potential piece of the puzzle. But there was no time to waste on superstition or idle speculation. They had to work quickly before the truth slipped further from their grasp. Lady Thornfield stood quietly by the window, her gaze distant, but it was clear that her thoughts were not entirely on the investigation. She seemed lost in her grief, the weight of her late husband's death still too heavy to bear. Her shoulders sagged, and the tremor in her hands was faint, but visible as she clutched the edge of the drapes. Holmes watched her for a moment, his gaze softening. "Lady Thornfield, might I suggest that we examine the rooms where the incidents have been most frequent? If you would show us to the places where you felt the presence of whatever it is that haunts this house." She hesitated, but then nodded slowly, leading them down the hall. Her steps were slow, as if every movement was a struggle, but she did not speak again until they reached the first of the rooms, the library, its grand shelves filled with dusty tomes, many of which had not been touched in years. "This is where it began," Lady Thornfield said softly. Her voice was almost lost in the vastness of the room, swallowed up by the towering bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. The faint scent of old paper mixed with the mustiness of the room, and Holmes noted the thick layer of dust that covered the floor, undisturbed by any recent activity. I heard the footsteps here late at night. It was as if someone walked in, but I was alone. Holmes stepped forward, his boots echoing on the hardwood floor, and his eyes scanned the room carefully. The large fireplace at the far end of the room was cold, the remnants of a fire long extinguished. A grandfather clock stood against the wall, its pendulum still, and its face dim with age. There was no sign of any disturbance, no footprints or marks in the dust. And yet, Holmes could feel the tension in the air, the same heavy, oppressive feeling that had lingered outside the manor. "Watson," Holmes said after a moment, "come here. Look at this." Watson stepped closer, peering over Holmes's shoulder as he knelt beside an old, weathered rug. The edges were worn, but it was what lay beneath that caught Holmes's attention. There, hidden beneath the rug, was a small, faint stain. Not of blood, but something darker, something more insidious. Holmes touched the stain carefully, his brow furrowing in concentration. It was a subtle clue, almost overlooked, but to his trained eye, it told a story. "It seems the stain is recent," Holmes murmured, his fingers brushing the fabric. "Yet it has been covered, hidden. Someone wanted this to remain unnoticed. A deliberate act." Lady Thornfield's eyes widened as she looked at the rug. I didn't notice that before," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is that blood?" "No," Holmes replied, his voice low but firm. "Not blood. But it's something that should not be ignored. It suggests that whatever happened here, whatever this house has witnessed, has been concealed, carefully hidden." Holmes stood and turned to the constable. "Have you found anything else? Anything unusual during your time here?" he asked, his voice steady. The constable shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Holmes's gaze. I've not found much, sir. There's nothing to speak of, except for the odd sounds and the strange behaviour of some of the servants. But there's nothing concrete." Holmes nodded slowly, his mind already calculating the possibilities. The constable was hiding something. The nervousness in his voice, the way he skirted around the question, told Holmes that he was not being forthcoming. "Very well," Holmes said, standing taller now, a quiet resolve settling into his posture. "We shall continue our search. But one thing is clear. This manor holds more than it is willing to reveal." The investigation had led them through every room in Thornfield House, each one more sombre than the last, until they found themselves standing in a dimly lit parlour that overlooked the manor's overgrown garden. Holmes was pacing slowly, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, his mind working relentlessly to piece together the puzzle. Watson, however, was absorbed in thought, his gaze distant as he absently traced the edge of his medical bag. Lady Thornfield sat near the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression distant, as though the weight of the past few days had taken its toll on her. The remnants of the fire that had once crackled in the hearth now lay cold and lifeless, the flickering shadows giving way to an oppressive quiet. The sense of dread that had accompanied them since their arrival had only deepened. Holmes's voice broke the stillness, sharp and measured. "We must speak with the servants, Watson. The answers are likely to be found in their observations, not just in the walls and objects of the house. They are the ones who have lived in the manor day in and day out. They may have seen something small perhaps, but crucial." Watson nodded, though a hint of reluctance coloured his expression. He had never been one to easily trust those in servitude, especially in matters such as these. However, Holmes was correct. The servants would have witnessed something. "We shall start with Miss Clara," Holmes continued, his gaze sweeping toward Lady Thornfield. "She is the maid, isn't she?" Lady Thornfield nodded stiffly, her gaze briefly meeting Holmes's before returning to the floor. "Yes, Miss Clara has been with us for many years. She's a quiet girl, always in the background. But I fear that the strain of everything..." Well, it may have caused her to become agitated. Holmes inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words. We will see what she has to say. It was not long before they were standing in the narrow, dimly lit hallway outside a small servant's room. The air here smelled faintly of soap and laundry, but there was also something else beneath it, something damp, like the faint scent of mildew. Holmes's sharp eyes scanned the door frame, noting the chipped wood and the thin layer of dust that settled along the baseboards. When the door opened, it revealed a young woman with pale skin and wide eyes. Miss Clara. She appeared startled by the sudden appearance of the detectives, her hands wringing the edges of her apron nervously. Her thin frame trembled ever so slightly as she looked from Holmes to Watson, as though unsure of how to behave in their presence. Miss Clara, Holmes began, his voice gentle yet firm, we are investigating the recent events here at Thornfield House. We would appreciate your help in providing any information you may have observed in the past few weeks. The maid hesitated, her gaze flicking briefly toward Lady Thornfield before she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know much, sir. I only know that things are different. Strange things have been happening. I've heard the noises at night, the footsteps in the halls, and the crying. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. Crying, you say? When did you hear this? Clara's voice trembled as she responded. It happens at night, sir, when the house is still. The weeping, it sounds like a woman in great sorrow. She paused, her fingers twisting the fabric of her apron even tighter. I thought it was Lady Thornfield at first, but then I realized it wasn't her voice at all. It was someone else. Holmes studied her closely, noting the flush that had crept into Clara's cheeks as she spoke. And when did you last hear these sounds, Miss Clara? She looked down at her feet, swallowing hard before answering. Last night, sir. It was late. I was in the laundry room folding linens, and I heard it, coming from upstairs. It sounded like someone was walking through the halls, but when I went to look, no one was there. Holmes took a slow breath, his mind sifting through the information. You said the footsteps were heard upstairs, and the crying. Did it come from the same direction? Clara nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Yes, sir. It was always from upstairs. The cries. They come from the west wing, I think. I've never dared go up there myself. It's too unsettling. Holmes's gaze shifted toward Lady Thornfield, who had remained silent during the conversation. Lady Thornfield, Holmes asked, his tone gentle but insistent. What is in the west wing? Lady Thornfield stiffened at the question, her fingers twitching slightly as she clenched her hands tighter. The west wing, she murmured, her voice barely audible, is where my husband's study was. It is locked now. I've not been in there since he passed. There was a moment of heavy silence as Holmes absorbed this new information. The west wing, locked away, hidden from view. There could be something in there, something tied to her husband's death that Lady Thornfield had deliberately kept from them. Or perhaps there was a much deeper secret buried within those walls. Holmes's voice broke through the silence. It seems we must examine the west wing next. It may hold the key to understanding everything that has happened here. Watson, still observing, spoke cautiously. Holmes, do you think Lady Thornfield knows something she's not telling us? Holmes considered the question for a moment, his gaze flicking to Lady Thornfield, who now appeared even more tense, her expression tightening with the suggestion of something unspoken. Perhaps, Holmes said, his voice cool, but she is a woman in mourning. Grief can cloud one's judgment, as well as one's memory. Still, I suspect she is hiding something, whether intentionally or not. We will see soon enough. Lady Thornfield stood up slowly, her expression unreadable. "I will take you to the West Wing," she said, her voice steady but laced with an underlying uncertainty. "But be warned, nothing good has ever come from that place." As she led them down the narrow, dark hallway, the oppressive atmosphere of the house seemed to tighten around them, and Holmes could feel the weight of the secrets lurking within these walls. They were close now, closer than ever to uncovering the truth. The hallways of Thornfield House grew colder as they ventured deeper into the West Wing. The air here was thick with the scent of old wood and decay, as if the very bones of the manor had started to wither in the shadows. Holmes could feel it more acutely now, an oppressive weight, heavier than the fog outside, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Each step they took seemed to echo louder than the last, the silence pressing in on them from every direction. Lady Thornfield's footsteps were slow, measured, though her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob of the study. The brass fixture was tarnished, its surface smooth but cold beneath her fingers. She paused for a moment, her eyes momentarily flicking to Holmes, as though searching for some reassurance. Her lips parted, but no words came, and after a moment, she gave a shallow nod and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dimly lit, the single window letting in only a sliver of pale light, the rest swallowed by the shadows that clung to the corners. Dust covered the furniture, the once grand desk now lost beneath a layer of neglect. Bookshelves lined the walls, their contents undisturbed, as though frozen in time. Holmes immediately noticed the locked cabinet against the far wall, its iron keyhole dark and waiting. It was clear that this room had not been touched in years, perhaps not since the death of Lady Thornfield's husband. "This is where it all began, Mr. Holmes," Lady Thornfield whispered, her voice shaking as she gestured to the room. "My husband's study. He was always so secretive, always buried in his work. I never questioned him. But now, I wonder, did I miss something? Could I have done something differently?" Holmes stepped into the room, his sharp gaze moving over every detail. "Perhaps, Lady Thornfield," he said softly, his voice gentle, "but the past cannot be changed. We must focus on what we can uncover now." He moved toward the desk, brushing his fingers lightly over the papers scattered across its surface. A few yellowed pages, faded with age, were scattered about, their writing barely legible. As he examined them more closely, a few words stood out, disjointed fragments of contracts, financial records, and correspondence that seemed to suggest a man deeply involved in shady dealings. But there was more. Several letters were written in a hurried scrawl, their contents cryptic and unsettling. Holmes picked up one of the letters and unfolded it carefully. The words were faint, but he could just make out the message. The secret must remain hidden. The consequences of revealing it would be dire. Only those who are worthy may be trusted. All else must be silenced. Holmes's brow furrowed as he read the letter again. "This is most troubling," he muttered, turning to Watson, who had been standing silently by the door, his expression thoughtful. "It seems your suspicions were correct. There was more going on here than mere business transactions. This is about something much darker." Watson's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward. "What do you mean, Holmes? Are you suggesting that Lady Thornfield's husband was involved in something criminal?" Holmes didn't immediately answer. Instead, he continued to sift through the papers on the desk, pulling out more letters, each one revealing a further layer of deceit. There were mentions of hidden assets, illegal dealings, and a shadowy group of individuals whose names were never fully written, only hinted at. But none of this explained the curse, the strange occurrences that had plagued the house. And certainly, none of it explained the recent death of the villager. "What we are dealing with here," Holmes said after a long silence, "is a far-reaching conspiracy, Watson. One that involves more than just Lady Thornfield's late husband. There are others involved, people who have worked hard to keep these secrets buried." At this, Lady Thornfield stirred, her eyes wide with disbelief. But I didn't know. I had no idea. My husband's affairs were always so private. I never questioned him, Mr. Holmes. I I only wanted to protect him. To protect us. Holmes regarded her for a moment, his expression softening, but there was no pity in his eyes. Instead, there was understanding, a recognition that grief often clouded one's judgment, especially when it was compounded by guilt. "Lady Thornfield," Holmes said, his tone gentle but firm, "you are not to blame for your husband's actions. However, the truth must come to light. It is the only way to free this house from its dark hold." As Holmes turned back to the desk, his fingers brushed against a small, inconspicuous box hidden behind a stack of papers. It was wooden, its surface polished but worn, with a simple brass latch. Without saying a word, he picked it up, noting how the weight of it seemed oddly significant, as though it carried the weight of secrets untold. Lady Thornfield watched him, her lips trembling as she opened her mouth to speak, but she seemed to lose her voice at the sight of the box. Holmes didn't hesitate. He undid the latch and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a velvet lining, was a small, ornate key, a key that seemed too familiar. Holmes's breath caught for just a moment before he regained his composure. The key was unmistakable. It was the same shape as the one on the locked cabinet. But this one was different. It gleamed with an unnatural shine, untouched by time or dust, as though it had been recently handled. "This," Holmes said, his voice low, "is the key to unlocking everything." Lady Thornfield's expression shifted, her eyes widening as realization dawned upon her. "The cabinet," she whispered. I thought it was sealed. I never dared to open it. My husband, he said it was for my protection." Holmes nodded slowly. "Indeed. And now we must see what he was protecting you from." The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, and all three turned to see the figure of Mr. Hammond standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. The sudden presence of the man sent a chill through the room, and Holmes immediately sensed that their investigation was about to take a darker turn. The air in the west wing of Thornfield House felt thick, as though every breath they took carried the weight of years of secrets. Holmes stood by the desk, his fingers lightly tapping against the small wooden box that contained the key, while Watson and Lady Thornfield exchanged glances, filled with both anxiety and uncertainty. The room was heavy with the expectation of what was to come, the shadows seeming to lengthen as the moments passed. Holmes could feel the pressure of it, of the mystery that had slowly unfurled around him, revealing layers of deception and tragedy that now demanded resolution. "Mr. Holmes," Lady Thornfield said, her voice low and hesitant, "you believe this key is the answer?" Holmes, his sharp gaze fixed on the key resting in the palm of his hand, nodded slowly. "Indeed. It is not merely a key, Lady Thornfield. It is a symbol of what has been hidden here, something your husband tried to protect. But from whom? And more importantly, why?" Lady Thornfield's expression was a mixture of sorrow and confusion. "I don't understand. My husband's death, the rumors of the curse, it all feels like a nightmare." "Perhaps it is a nightmare," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to her, "but one woven with threads of greed, deception, and—" He paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. "Murder." Watson stepped forward, his brow furrowed in thought. "You think Lady Thornfield's husband was murdered? But why? What motive could there be?" Holmes didn't immediately respond. Instead, he turned his attention to the locked cabinet across the room, the one that Lady Thornfield had mentioned. The key in his hand seemed to glow in the dim light, its significance growing more apparent with each passing second. There was something deeply important within that cabinet, something that could explain everything: the footsteps in the halls, the weeping widow, the village's belief in a curse, and most crucially, the village's death. Holmes's mind clicked into motion, processing the information at an almost dizzying speed. "Lady Thornfield," he said, his voice firm and resolute, "it is imperative that we open that cabinet now." Her face paled, but she didn't argue. "Very well. she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I warn you, Mr. Holmes, there is nothing in that room that will bring comfort." She led them across the room, and with trembling hands, she unlocked the cabinet, the soft click of the lock echoing in the otherwise silent room. As the door swung open, Holmes immediately took in the contents. Inside, tucked away under a velvet cloth, were several documents, their edges frayed with age. Holmes's fingers slid over them with the care of someone handling fragile history, and as he scanned the papers, his expression remained unreadable. "I see," Holmes said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "These documents, they are not financial records, as I had expected." "What are they?" Watson asked, stepping closer. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he continued to examine the papers, his mind racing. The documents were filled with strange symbols, intricate diagrams, and references to places that Holmes recognized: ancient temples, forbidden rites, and secret societies. It was clear that Lady Thornfield's husband had been involved in something far darker than simple business transactions. Holmes pulled out one particular paper, its surface worn but still legible. The ink was smudged in places, but the meaning was unmistakable. The document detailed an ancient ritual, one that involved the sacrifice of a life to gain power, to secure a future. A future that Lady Thornfield's husband had been seeking at any cost. Holmes felt the weight of the discovery settle heavily on him. This was not just about financial dealings. This was a man obsessed with power, willing to go to any lengths to secure it, even if it meant sacrificing others in the process. "I believe," Holmes said slowly, his voice carrying the gravity of his words, "that your husband's death was no accident. He was killed because he knew too much. He had uncovered something that threatened to unravel everything he had worked for, something tied to these documents." Lady Thornfield's face contorted with grief and disbelief. "Are you saying my husband was murdered? And all this time I thought it was a curse. The rumours, the whispers." Holmes nodded. "The curse is a ruse, Lady Thornfield, a distraction. But the murder is real, and it's tied to a secret your husband uncovered, one that led to his death." The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows pressing in, as if the very house was recoiling from the truth now surfacing. The weeping widow, the footsteps in the halls, the mysterious death of the villager. Everything now connected in a web of lies and manipulation that stretched back to her husband's involvement with shadowy figures who had hidden themselves behind the guise of superstition. Watson, ever the pragmatist, leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. "But why, Holmes? Why kill him? And why create this elaborate web of lies? Why the curse?" Holmes slowly stood, his gaze now fixed on the papers before him, his mind working through the final pieces of the puzzle. "The answer lies in the conspiracy your husband stumbled upon, Watson. This man, your husband, was part of something much larger, something ancient, something secret. And in uncovering it, he became a threat. His murder was a way to silence him, to prevent the truth from coming to light. And as for the curse..." Holmes's voice softened for a moment, the faintest hint of an understanding sadness creeping in. "It was merely a tool, a weapon, to keep everyone in fear, to keep them from digging too deeply." Lady Thornfield's hands trembled, and she stepped back from the desk, as though the weight of the truth was too much to bear. "But why? Why did he keep this from me? Why did he protect me from it?" Holmes's gaze softened slightly. "Fear, my lady. Fear and guilt. He knew the danger he was in, and perhaps in some way he wanted to protect you from the very thing that killed him. But now, we must finish what he started. We must uncover the full extent of this conspiracy." As Holmes spoke, the shadows seemed to deepen around them, the weight of the past pressing heavily on the present. There was no turning back now. They had come too far to retreat into the world of superstition and rumour. The truth was there, hidden in the walls of Thornfield House, and it was up to them to uncover it. The oppressive silence in the West Wing had thickened, now heavier with the knowledge they had uncovered. The once grand study, now suffused with shadows, seemed to close in on them as they prepared to confront the final truth. Lady Thornfield, pale and trembling, stood by the window, her gaze lost in the depths of the garden below. Her hands, once trembling, were now still, pressed tightly against her sides as she struggled to make sense of the discovery that had so abruptly turned her world upside down. Holmes stood by the desk, the papers he had carefully examined still spread across its surface. The key, which had unlocked the secrets of Thornfield House, rested on the desk beside them. His eyes, though calm, betrayed a depth of understanding that extended beyond the words on the pages before him. He had pieced together the story, the conspiracy, the murder, the cover-up. But now, it was time to confront the man behind it all. "Holmes," Watson said softly, his voice filled with urgency, "we must be prepared for what comes next. This conspiracy, it stretches far beyond just Lady Thornfield's husband, doesn't it?" Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the desk. "Indeed, Watson. I believe we are dealing with a group of people, an organization perhaps, who will stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. But now, we are close. Too close to turn back." Lady Thornfield's voice, hoarse and uncertain, cut through the stillness. You think I knew nothing of this?" Her eyes met Holmes for the first time since they'd uncovered the documents. There was desperation in her gaze. "Do you think I would have allowed such things to happen in my own home?" Holmes turned to her, his expression unwavering. "I believe you were kept in the dark, Lady Thornfield. I believe your husband, in his fear and guilt, sought to protect you, even if it meant deceiving you." Her face softened at his words, but a new, darker thought began to form in her mind. "And what of Mr. Hammond?" she asked, her voice faltering. "Do you think he knows? He was always there, always advising my husband." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "I believe Mr. Hammond knows more than he's letting on." As if on cue, the door to the study creaked open, and Mr. Hammond stepped inside, his figure tall and imposing in the doorway. His expression was calm, but the faint tension in his posture told Holmes everything he needed to know. He had expected this moment, and now the confrontation was inevitable. "Well, well, Mr. Holmes," Hammond said, his voice smooth, though laced with a subtle menace. "It seems you've uncovered all the secrets of Thornfield House. But I must say, I didn't expect you to be so thorough." Holmes stood tall, his posture unyielding. "Mr. Hammond," he said, his voice measured, "I suspect you've been playing a very dangerous game for quite some time now, and I believe it's time you explain yourself." Hammond smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Explain myself?" he echoed, a hint of amusement in his tone. "You really think I'm going to explain myself to you, Mr. Holmes? You've gathered a few scattered pieces of information, but you don't yet understand the full picture. You don't understand what's at stake." Lady Thornfield, who had been standing quietly, now stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "What is this, Mr. Hammond?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "What is it that you and my husband were involved in? What secret was he hiding?" Hammond's eyes flicked toward her, and for a brief moment there was something cold and calculating in his gaze. He took a step forward, his boots echoing ominously on the wooden floor. "Your husband was a fool," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. He thought he could control it, thought he could hide it. But power, true power, isn't something you can keep hidden for long. And now, you're all caught in a game you can't win. Holmes took a slow, deliberate step toward him. "What do you mean by power, Mr. Hammond? What is it you were after?" Hammond smiled again, his lips curling into a cruel grin. "You'll find out soon enough, Mr. Holmes. The people I work for, they've always known how to deal with problems. And you, my friend, are now a problem." A tense silence stretched between them. The weight of Hammond's words hung heavy in the air, and Holmes could sense the shift, the moment where everything changed. They were no longer merely solving a mystery. Now they were uncovering a conspiracy that reached far beyond Thornfield House. Hammond wasn't just a man trying to protect a secret. He was part of something much larger, something far more dangerous. Lady Thornfield, still struggling to grasp the full scope of the situation, stepped forward once more. "You're part of this organization, aren't you?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and disgust. This conspiracy. You were the one who made my husband think he had to protect me from the truth, from the danger. You did this to him. You did this to all of us." Hammond's smile faltered for just a moment, and in that fleeting instant, Holmes saw the flicker of something. Guilt, perhaps, or the realization that his carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. "The truth is a dangerous thing, Lady Thornfield," Hammond said, his voice no longer as confident. "Some truths are better left buried, but I'm afraid you've reached the end of the line now. There's no going back." Holmes knew that the time for subtlety was over. The pieces had fallen into place, and it was now time to confront the man who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. "You've made a grave mistake, Mr. Hammond," Holmes said, his voice cold with the certainty of someone who knew the truth. "The game is up." Hammond's eyes flickered with something, a mix of fear and rage, as he took a step back, his hand moving toward his coat pocket, where Holmes had no doubt a weapon was concealed. But before Hammond could act, the door behind him suddenly burst open, and the constable rushed in, his hand firmly gripping a baton. "Enough!" the constable shouted, his voice trembling but resolute. "Mr. Hammond, you are under arrest." The tension in the room snapped, the weight of the moment finally breaking as Hammond's defiance crumbled. The constable's presence, combined with Holmes's unyielding resolve, had finally cornered the man. Holmes watched as Hammond's posture sagged, his attempts at bravado disappearing under the weight of his own guilt. "You think you've won, Holmes?" he spat, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't over. It's just begun." Holmes's gaze remained steady as he spoke, the finality in his words undeniable. "No, Mr. Hammond. It's over." As the constable led Hammond away, the room seemed to exhale, the air once thick with menace now clear, if only for a moment. Holmes turned to Lady Thornfield, his expression softening ever so slightly. "The truth has come to light, Lady Thornfield," he said quietly. "It's time for you to begin healing, free from the lies that have haunted this house." Lady Thornfield's eyes welled with tears, but she did not speak. Instead, she nodded, her shoulders sagging with the weight of the revelation. The truth had been uncovered, and though the darkness had not been entirely vanquished, it had lost its grip on Thornfield House. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt a fragile sense of peace settle over her. The wind had died down, leaving a silence that seemed to settle over Thornfield House like a heavy blanket. The morning light, pale and diffused by the remnants of fog, poured through the windows of the study. The room, which had once felt so charged with the tension of unsolved mysteries and hidden truths, now seemed to breathe easier. It was as if the house itself was exhaling, casting off the weight of its secrets. Lady Thornfield sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap. Her face was pale, the lines of grief still etched deeply across her features, but there was something else in her eyes now, something akin to relief. She had weathered the storm, had faced the darkness that had hung over her for so long, and now, finally, the truth had been revealed. Holmes stood near the desk, his sharp eyes still scanning the room. He had not moved from his place by the window for some time, his gaze focused inward, as if piecing together the last fragments of the case. Watson, standing by the door, watched the interaction in silence. His role in this case had always been more of a spectator, offering support and analysis where needed. But even he could see the change in Lady Thornfield. The weight she had carried seemed to have lessened, if only for a moment. "Lady Thornfield," Holmes said finally, his voice soft but firm, "I trust you now understand the full extent of the situation." She nodded slowly, her eyes downcast. "Yes, I do. And I can hardly believe it. Everything he did, my husband, I never thought he would become involved in such darkness. I wanted so desperately to believe that he had been the victim of some supernatural force, but... Her voice faltered as she struggled to find the words. But the truth is far more chilling. Holmes didn't speak immediately. His mind, sharp as ever, was still processing the implications of the case. There were still pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit, but the heart of the mystery had been unravelled. He knew that Lady Thornfield's life would never be the same. The house would never be the same. "You must understand, Lady Thornfield," Holmes continued, his voice steady. "Your husband's actions were not driven by a desire to harm you. He was a man trapped by his own ambitions and fears. In the end, he sought to protect you from the very truth that would have destroyed him." Lady Thornfield's eyes, though filled with sorrow, met Holmes's with a newfound clarity. "But he didn't protect me, did he?" she whispered. "He left me with the burden of a lie that has haunted me, that I've lived with for all these years." Holmes nodded solemnly, acknowledging the depth of her pain. The truth, no matter how difficult, is always better than living in the shadows of falsehood. There was a long silence as they both absorbed the weight of the words. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, its rhythm steady, as if marking the passing of time. The room seemed to have changed somehow, now filled with the quiet reverberations of a mystery solved. Yet, despite the resolution, there was still an air of melancholy, as though the ghosts of the past lingered in the corners of the room. Watson cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. "Holmes, now that the case is solved, what do you think will happen to Thornfield House? To Lady Thornfield?" Holmes turned toward Watson, his sharp gaze lingering for a moment before he spoke. "Thornfield House will be left to Lady Thornfield, of course. She may choose to stay, to move on, or perhaps to rid herself of its oppressive weight altogether. As for Mr. Hammond, his fate has already been sealed. He will stand trial for his crimes, along with any others who were involved in the conspiracy." Lady Thornfield stood from her seat, her movements slow but purposeful. She walked over to the desk, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge, as if reassuring herself that the past had truly been put to rest. "I will remain here for now," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I owe it to my husband's memory to understand the full extent of his actions, but I will not let his mistakes define my future." Holmes gave her a quiet nod, his eyes filled with understanding. "That is the right course of action, Lady Thornfield. You are free now to choose your own path." The silence returned, but it was different now. The oppressive weight had lifted, leaving behind only the echoes of the past, which, over time, would fade into nothing more than a memory. As Holmes and Watson made their way toward the door, Watson couldn't help but glance back at Lady Thornfield, who was now standing by the window, her gaze lost in the distant horizon. He saw the quiet strength in her posture, the resilience that had always been there, hidden beneath layers of grief and confusion. "I think," Watson said softly, "she'll be all right." Holmes paused before answering, his gaze fixed on Lady Thornfield for a moment longer. "She will," he said simply. "She will, in time." As they stepped outside, the world seemed brighter, as though the fog had finally lifted. The mansion, once a place of dark secrets, now stood in the soft light of the morning, its facade no longer shrouded in mystery. Holmes adjusted his coat and turned to Watson, his expression once again returning to that familiar, calculating look. "The case is closed," Holmes said, his voice carrying the familiar, unwavering confidence that Watson had come to expect. "Another puzzle solved, but there is always another waiting, another mystery to be unravelled. Perhaps one day, Watson, we will be called to solve one more that will rival even this one." Watson smiled, the corners of his mouth curling upward. "I have no doubt, Holmes. I have no doubt." And so, with the mystery of Thornfield House behind them, the two friends turned and walked away from the mansion, their silhouettes fading into the horizon, leaving behind the quiet hum of a world that had just been made whole once more.